So we're going to use the exact same information. I'm going to take a copy of that table. This is the writer of a call option. And I'll take the exact same information that I have for Apple. No point doing up anything else new. So you wrote the option, which means you're like the insurance company. Again, you sold it at a strike of 275 when the stock was 276.10. And you feel, whatever it is your strategy is, but let's just say you feel that the stock price wasn't going to go higher and you felt this was going to be a no-brainer, and you sell the stock and you're going to take 13.10 from whoever wants to buy it from you. So in that case, what I suggested there is you take the 13.10, so all your premiums here are positive. So get rid of those negative numbers. You're receiving money. And here you have your scenarios, what actually happens and what could happen on the upside as well. Exercise or abandon the call. What does the writer do? Does the writer exercise or abandon?
The buyer is the one who abandoned.
Exactly. Okay, I just put that question out there, not just to trick you or anything like that, but just to see, did it confuse you? And if it confused you, you probably were aware that the writer does not exercise. So you need to write a note here. The writer will never exercise or abandon the option. It's always the buyer. So what we see here, exercise or abandon the call, I'm going to put in the buyer. The buyer does this. And it's exactly what we have here. So everything is the same. The only difference is that we got rid of the negative and turned it into a positive for the premium. So what happens to the writers, back to the writer, what happens to the writer's profit or loss? Well, because the buyer abandoned, they left the premium with you, and therefore you have a gain of $13.10. Again, the buyer doesn't owe you $50. They abandoned the option and they left the $13.10 with you. Likewise, we didn't have to do this calculation because you still get the same answer. They keep the $13.10. But in this scenario here, the stock price went marginally above the strike of $1.10. So of the $13.10 that the buyer gave you, you give them $1.10 back. Therefore, you end up with $12. Do you understand that part? Why you end up with $12 as the writer?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So remember, the buyer will always dictates on what the buyer does. They exercise. Remember, I said to you earlier on, if you wrote the note up here, for the call option, if the actual price ends up being greater than the strike, you take them away. Here you have $1.10. That's what the buyer keeps. They exercised it. You have to give them the $1.10. So of their $13.10 that they gave you a couple of months ago, you give them $1.10 back, which means you have $12 left over. Likewise, all you have, whatever was positive for the buyer, it becomes negative for the seller. And whatever was negative for the buyer, and it becomes positive for the seller. So in this case, the buyer exercised the option. You owe them $25. Of the $25 you give the buyer, you give them back the $13.10 that they gave you earlier on as insurance, which means you have to come up with another $11.90. Okay, so all you did was negative 25 plus $13.10, you owe them $11.90. Here, again, likewise, I'll just repeat myself. The stock ends up being $50 more than the strike. The buyer exercised. They want $50 from you. You have to give them $50, but you don't have negative 50 down here. Why? Because you used the $13.10 the buyer gave you a few months ago as part of that payment, which means you have to come up with another $36.90. So these two combined is your $50 that you owe the buyer. Okay. And if we were to draw the diagram for the writer of the call option, get rid of all of this. Okay, okay, there's your line anyway. If you recall, you had the writer, this is the writer of a call. They received $13.10. What's their break even?
It's the same.
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same break even. Okay, because they've received $13.10. Remember, it's a mirror image. They received their $13.10. And the stock has to move from the strike at 275 up to whatever that is, 288.10. So this distance here, is your 13.10. So you receive that. You will break even if the stock continues to rise. Remember, the buyer will start exercising the option once the stock gets higher than the strike, which means you are going to start losing that premium. You give it all up when the stock ends up being 288.10, and you start losing more and more and more as the stock rises. And that's what we see here. You start losing more and more as the stock price rises above the strike. So that distance that we have marked here, I'm going to mark it off here and gauge it. This is my plus 13.10 because I received this premium from the buyer. Okay, so that's the mirror image. I had a negative 13.10 here for the buyer. It's plus 13.10. When the buyer abandons the option, you keep the 13.10. So that's why it flat lines at any price below the strike, and I stop right at the strike. But the stock started to rise above the strike, and the buyer started to exercise. So you give up $1.10 here. So when the stock is 276.10, you start giving it up, and you only end up with a profit now of 12. You're starting to give away that profit. And if the stock keeps on going higher, you end up losing more until you break even. I just overshot it there. And you continue losing and losing and losing. So at that point, what I'm going to write here is the buyer abandons and the buyer exercises again at a price higher than the strike. And the buyer abandons up to the strike, and the buyer exercises beyond the strike. And again, you can fill all this out yourselves. Look, you're in the money here. It's the opposite, in the money, because you're making money. You're out of the money. This is your strike. This is your break even. You have a limited gain. You don't earn any more because the buyer will always abandon, so your gains are limited. But here you have unlimited losses. And that's why you should never write calls naked, okay? Because you're going to be exposed to these unlimited losses if the stock keeps on rallying.